First World War tanks, very slow, very moderate. In the end, very effective. If you're holding a fence against one of those you can cross the just about coming to the end of the run. It's not so bad the second the Mark IV and you see where he's going, but the driver of the A7V is just a little back. What happens to box shot with the aid of video cameras, the ending of that, we're going on to do beautiful life, maybe inside the races. I reckon the ground's a bit rough for them to run around today, so we're treating them as static exhibits. If you get a chance, go and chat to people with, especially with Irish Army representatives over there, because that car, Steve Hanneman, is very famous. It was the car that was escorting the convoy in August 1922, I think, when General Michael Collins, the Irish leader, was, some say assassinated, some say killed by accident, but there was a shooting match with the irregulars and Collins was hit in the head and killed. The name Steve Hanneman actually translates rather conveniently into the mountains, or Mountain of Wings, or Wings Mountain. I won't tell you why, it takes too long. It's a landmark in County Tipperary, in fact, which has a lot of legend attached to it, and the name is translated to the car. There is a proper Celtic spelling, which I won't even try and pronounce, but the Steve Hanneman is about as good as I can give you in English. Both cars were originally built in Britain, and we presented the Irish Free State Army with 13 Rolls Royces when we left the town. This is the only survivor. The car stayed in service in Ireland until 1954, for which time they were desperately short of wheels and tyres. This one has been preserved and was recently restored to magnificent order, really full authentic order, by James Black of Belfast, who did a superb job. And the two cars are worth looking at side by side. Funnily enough, I reckon that the Irish car is more authentic, more original, shall we say, than the British one. The British cars tended to get updated, and most notably you'll see that the bridging planks, which are on both sides of the car, they're vertical of the Irish car as they were on all the original 20-ton Rolls Royces. On our car, they actually slot underneath the run, so that was a change that happened during the development of them. It's a pity we can't run them, but really probably just as well for their own sake. They're very expensive vehicles. We wouldn't want to get them dirty even if we fall into a hole or something. Now the Mark IV of the A7V is gradually making their way around the arena. I'm going to do one circuit, we thought life is too short. You'll notice, by the way, on the Mark IV that there are some coloured stripes on the front, red and white. These were introduced in the early summer of 1918, really to distinguish the tanks from the ones that the Germans had. The Germans made flying crossing words to make sure they there's. We went to the red and white stripes. Now, they were only two then. And we used after 1918, summer of 1918. The Mark IV served 712 battalions right through the end of the war. Tank battalions, roughly 48 tanks, two big companies, and operating units. Very rare to come up with. Most of the tank battles that were held in the war were large, huge arrangements. You couldn't send a few tanks to whack here and there. They were too slow, that's why complex. 9 battalions they literally swamped the battle. And really that takes a lot of things. The Germans were there's a rumour that 2 A7Vs were sold to the Polish army after the First World War, but that's largely discounted. Now, most of the A7Vs actually ended up in other hands. Tank went to America, tank Paris, and in London they argued they would make the whole chance raise but unfortunately they were all scrapped. There's only one left, and that's the Mephisto, which is the Australia it's the only German A7V and left. The Germans have a replica which they built for their own German company. But it's rubbish, it's not better than the original, it's not the run. So this is sad, you have to go all the way to Britain if you want to see a real German A7V. So you have to make the most of what we've got here, the wooden replica built by Bob Run. But it's really doing very well, considering that the driver in this A7V is out front, getting away at the back and is driving it with the aid of the TV camera at the screen. Not too badly at all. See with the Mark IV, the way the tracks go all the way round straight. They're very strong.
Now, the first replica, the Mark IV, was built for the War Horse movie, and we have purchased it and now run it ourselves. The A7V replica was built by Bob Grundy of Wigan, and it was done really as a project without any movie attached to it, but it's a very good-looking replica and gives you some idea of what the German tanks of the First World War would have looked, or did look like. In fact, there are only a few of them, but that's how they looked. But I'm going to treat them both as if they were real, otherwise it gets too confusing. So I want you to imagine that Mark IV coming into the arena now is an original First World War Mark IV of 1917.
It's about the speed that go out.
Now, it's a mail tank, that is to say it has a 57mm cannon in the sponsor on each side. If it were not a male tank, it would be a female tank, funny enough, and that would have smaller sponsors with Lewis guns in on each side, but on this version we've got the male with the bigger guns in. No British tank of the First World War had any springs at all. They literally run heavily straight on the ground. Wow. And that's one of the reasons they only go slowly. The other reason is they're powered by a 105 horsepower Daimler engine. That's a British Daimler with the American Knight sleeve valve system. And by the time that had gone through a 2-speed and reverse gearbox and secondary gears, it really reduced the speed to a crawl. But as I said earlier, that's really all they needed, just slow enough for the infantry to walk with them, or behind them if possible, for safety. When they were advancing, they didn't need to go fast, and it wouldn't have helped if they had done. The A7V was a bit faster normally, but it was sprung, so you got a more comfortable ride. But then the tracks of the A7V, as you can see, are completely hidden under the vehicle. whereas on the Mark IV they go all the way around the frames on both sides. That's because when the British designed these tanks, they were thinking of them as an antidote to those 8 men. 2 on each side serve the guns, while the other 4 are all engaged in driving. The chap sitting front right would be the driver. He'd have the gear change in his hands and could make it go forwards and backwards. The chap on his left would be the officer with the steering levers, and he'd make the tank steer left and right a little bit. But if they wanted to do a major turn, then they had to call on the services of 2 gearsmen stationed at the back of the tank. And they changed gear on secondary gears outboard of the main gearbox, and in doing that the tank had to stop in order to steer at all. It was a very slow and long-winded process, but as they got more experienced and quicker at it, they could do it so quickly you wouldn't notice it stopping. The German tank, on the other hand, requires a crew of 18, and most of those people were involved in working the guns. The A7V has one 57mm gun in the nose, and then up to 6 machine guns all around the hull on both sides and at the back. And those 6 machine guns each require 2 men, so you can soon see how they'd use up 18. The driver and his mate sat in the lookout on top of the tank, and then they had 2 engineers who did maintenance and kept the engines running. Inside the A7V, you've got 2 4-cylinder Daimler engines. They're German Daimler, of course, and they drive to a multi-speed, 3-speed gearbox, which is multi-directional. In other words, you can go either way just as easily, which you can't do quite so well in the Mark IV. Makes them more flexible that way, and if you can remember to put it in reverse at the right time, you can get a good performance out of it. Because with 18 people in there, it meant that if you did happen to knock out a German tank, you've got a problem dealing with 18 very cross men who get out of it. But most of the time they tended not to use their tanks so aggressively as the British. They only had 20 of them to begin with. The production of the Mark IV ran to about 1,200 tanks, and they were used in the early summer of 1917 right through to the end of the First World War. There were still 2 battalions who were using these tanks right up until the last battles, that 7th and 12th Battalion of the Tank Corps. And they would continue to keep the older tanks in use right to the end. The A7Vs, which say they only had 20, generally succumbed either to shell fire or sometimes to mechanical breakdown. And the Germans that tended to rely on the tanks they'd captured from the British at the Battle of Cambrai. They had a good selection of those, but even then, although they used them once or twice, they didn't use them with quite so much verve, perhaps as the British did. There was only one action between a British and German tank in the First World War. This occurred on April the 23rd, 1918, and it involved a Mark IV male, like the one leading, and an A7V, and they were engaged in a bit of a duel, which the British tank won. At least it knocked the German tank out and set it alight, so the crew abandoned it. But a little while later, the Mark IV was hit by shell fire, which broke the track. And at the same time, the crew of the A7V got back into their vehicle when the fire died down, and they realised it wasn't going to explode. And they reversed off the battlefield. So although it was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory, it's always been put down as a British victory, except by the Germans, who have it another way. There were 1 or 2 actions involving British and German manned tanks, but in each case, they were all Mark IVs, either what the Germans called a Bootpanzer or booty tank, or a British Mark IV. Those actions happened a couple of times. But there was literally only the one battle between the Mark IV and the single tank.
Something they're all very excited to do. But in the meantime, we do have our climbing wall that's identified by 2 rather large flags on the top of it over in the field area. So do come along and give it a go.
It's surprisingly tough to do, isn't it?
It's challenging, I think. There are 4 different phases, and the young ones seem to do rather better than me by keeping the
carrying more weight, I think that's what it is. And of course the cadet's a really important part of the services, and presumably you've got information as well for anybody who might be interested in getting involved in that.
Absolutely. Just next door to our climbing wall, we have our recruiting trailer, and we're constantly recruiting cadets and new adults as well. So if you're interested, do come along, try and climb the wall, and we'll probably see you some information.
And if we're talking to you, Sergeant Major, men and women always